Hi everyone, it's Ellie and welcome to the Curious Geographer. I'm so excited that for our last interview of this series, we are speaking to Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University. And if you haven't already checked out the amazing live interviews that have happened earlier this term, please do. There's a QR code that you can scan and they're all up available as well to watch. So this has been, I think, the fifth series, so definitely check out those live interviews. So a lot of people already on, which is fantastic. So today we will be speaking to Professor Danny Dorling, and we're going to be focusing on his new book called Fintopia, which is co-authored by Annika Koljonen. Danny, you'll have to tell me how to pronounce her surname. I'm really sorry about that. But it's almost a handbook on how countries can create an equal society. And Danny has also published many books on inequality. So my favourite being the 32 Stops, Lives on the Central Line, where he follows how lives differ going along the tube line from west to east. Danny has also written many other books focusing on inequality, such as The Equality Effect, Peak Inequality and the 1%. And what I love about Danny's books, which we're going to be talking about today, is the amount of graphs and data that supports the research findings. And we are going to have a look at some graphs today linking to Finland as well. So Danny has also worked with a group of researchers and works on this amazing website called World Mapper, which I'll put a link into the comments if you haven't checked that out already, where territories are resized on each map according to the subject of interest, whether that be earthquake risk or access to clean water or coronavirus data. But if I go straight into our questions, Danny, your book Fintopia is incredibly informative and investigates equality, and there's so many geographical statistics. Would you mind, just to start us all on the same level playing field, although this is quite a hard question potentially, how would you define inequality? No, how would you define equality, and how actually can equality be measured?
Thank you for that. It is a very hard question because when we talk about equality, we're often thinking about differences between men and women, between boys and girls, talking about racial inequalities, differences for people who are disabled and not disabled. The way I look at it as a whole is to say, can people take part in the norms of society? Are you able to do what most people can do? And you can be excluded from that in two ways. You can have too few resources to be able to take part in the norms of society, or occasionally you can be excluded on the other side. You know, you're so well off that in fact you don't fit in with the rest of society. So I use that definition, and then the most important thing for inequality tends to be household income. It's how much money you have, because money is the ticket that allows you to take part. If you can't afford, well, literally say a cinema ticket, if you can't afford to go to the cinema ever because you never have enough money for that, then you can't take part in that society. And it oddly turns out that income appears to be much more important than wealth, if you want to be technical about it. Countries which have very low income inequalities, where the amount of money that people receive every week and every month is quite similar, are the ones which are most inclusive, where few people are missing out. And there are quite a few countries around the world like this. Finland obviously is the example we're going to talk about, but Japan's another country which is very equal in terms of income equality. And people often talk about Japan as having a 90% middle class or a 90% working class, because you don't know what to call it when 90% of the people are in it. Whereas an unequal society is one with very much wider income inequalities, and that tends to exacerbate the other inequalities. So racial inequalities become much worse in somewhere like the USA, where the income inequalities are wide. And it's quite hard to keep racial inequalities as an issue when people are paid roughly the same amount of money. They kind of disappear. And similarly with gender inequalities. When people are paid roughly very similar amounts of money to do jobs, one of the core things about gender inequality, which is women getting less than men, well, that reduces dramatically. Whereas in a country like Britain, where we're happy for some people to be paid very lowly and other people to be very highly, It's the majority of the lowly paid are women, and the majority of the very highly paid are men, and then you get a gender inequality. So I'm sorry for such a long kind of explanation, but the crunch of it is income is the key thing. If you can sort out income inequalities and reduce them, you get a much more cohesive society.
Brilliant. And so your book, Fintopia, really focuses on kind of the equality in Finland and yeah, as I said, almost like a handbook that countries could look at, and particularly as it's so close in Europe as well. But why is Finland so equal? And also, has it always been an equal society?
It's brilliant questions. Well, somewhere in Europe has to be the most equal place in Europe. So if it wasn't Finland, it would be somewhere else. But it happens to be Finland, and it's also probably the most equal place in the world at the moment. So it's not that far away, and you can have a look at it. And if you're interested in whether greater equality causes problems, we can actually go and have a look at Finland and say, do things begin to go wrong? Finland, and common to almost all of Europe, 100 years ago was incredibly unequal. We're speaking in England, and 100 years ago, the most common job for women in England was to be a servant. And we had an aristocracy with big houses. We had enormous income and wealth gaps. Finland had similar gaps 100 years ago. It had a civil war, had a thing called the Terror, in which many, many people died. And so Finland hasn't always been how it is now at all. It became more equal, and most European countries became more equal in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. What's interesting about Finland is that it managed to hold on to a lot of that equality, whereas other countries became more unequal in the 80s and 90s. And what we are trying to look at is how did they manage to do that in Finland, and also what goes wrong, what doesn't work in a society with high levels of equality.
Brilliant. And I was going to say for everybody watching, if you do have any questions, please do write them in the chat, and we'll either ask them as we go through or afterwards as well. So in your in the book there, you look at lots of different data, so from the Human Development Index to, as you said, looking at income inequality, and you also look at happiness. So Finland is top for saying they are happy all or most of the time. So why does happiness? How is happiness linked to equality? And I'll show the graph as well that has the data on.
This was quite good news for me and Annika, because the reason we started writing the book was that Finland 4 years ago had just become, I think it had beaten Norway, I've forgotten, but just become the happiest country in the world. And then as we were writing the book and as the hardback was published, year after year, it kept on this slot. Now, the key thing here is the question. The question is all things considered, how happy are you? And what the Finns are very good at is considering all things. It is, in the context of what you can expect, how's it going? And that's part of the reason why the Finns are happy. They're also happy because their housing is sorted out. You won't see homeless people in Finland. The education system is brilliant. They have the highest work-life balance measured in the world. And in fact, Finland scored first, second, or third on over I think 110 social statistics now worldwide. But it's not a smug kind of happiness. It's a we can't really complain, happiness. And it's important to explain this, because we have different concepts of happiness in different parts of the world. And the classic example is, if you were to ask an average person in the USA, how are you doing? The answer you'll get back is, I'm doing great, because that's the cultural norm. That's what you say. But actually, if you ask in more depth, you often find that people aren't doing great. And if you, for instance, look at mental health, you'll find it's very bad in the USA. Whereas in Finland, particularly for younger people, although people worry about mental health, they have the best scores in the world for low rates of anxiety and depression and so on. And that really matters for happiness as well. But at some point, Finland will be knocked off this top slot. And they're a bit sick of hearing about it in Finland now. But all things considered, people in Finland will say, yes, it's going well. And that does reflect the fact that it largely is going well.
some people, particularly students, when they're growing up, maybe think that money equates to happiness. So how does the Finnish model, this kind of shows though they're not a correlation.
Yeah,
I'm trying to work out the word.
No, not at all. No, it's easy to see that people think that having more money will make them happier. And this is partly why you have to measure things and show things. So again, to go back to the United States, if we look at issues like anxiety and depression, and particularly people taking medication for this, it's places like Beverly Hills which have the highest rates of medication. You know, pretty affluent parts of the USA, but not particularly happy people in those places. It's not having to be afraid, not having to fear, not having to think that you always need more. If you don't have enough money, you won't be safe, or thinking you need more and more money. You know, that doesn't actually make you happy, and it certainly doesn't make a country happy. You know, if you're, you know, I should try to not go on and on about Britain, but it's just to try to understand it. In this country, I'm in the top 10%. The top 10% of people in this country are taking 40% of all income. You know, if you don't get into the top 10%, you'll be living on 60% of income. The difference is huge. And so people will think, oh, I must get more money to be happy. But all that happens is you end up in the top 10%. And then you worry, oh, I still can't afford a house. I still can't do this because I need to be in the top 5%. You talk to people in the top 5% and you find they need to be, and so on and so on and so on. And they're always running out of money. That's the funny thing in Britain. It's never enough. Whereas somewhere like Finland, where, for instance, all the schooling is free, hardly anybody, there's a tiny private sector, but essentially it's less than 1%, and has fees that are often only a few £100s a year. You don't have to worry about things like the cost of school. You don't have to worry about paying for university because, of course, that's the European norm. You're not charged fees to go to university. But also, if you do get more and more money, it'll be taxed at a higher rate, so you won't see that much of it. So, you know, it's a bit pointless simply trying to get rich for the sake of getting rich. And similarly, if you fall on hard times, or you become ill, or you split up from your partner, well, you're not going to see your life dissolve in the way it will in a more unequal society. And that sense of security, that idea that it will be okay, leads to an underlying level of calmness and happiness, which then lets people do other things. It lets the politicians in Finland have green targets that we could only dream of, you know, because we're too busy worrying about our other problems we have to say that we want to actually get things seriously done by 2030 and 2035 and so on. And then you can begin to have pride in what you're achieving more generally. Or just to give you one last statistic on this, a few years ago, Finland recorded the lowest infant mortality rate that the human species had ever seen. So it's incredibly, so you don't, not having to worry about the health of children and you can get used to it. You sort of take it for granted, but it does have a much wider effect on the population than simply, thankfully, saving the lives of a few babies.
Mm-hmm. And I really like that link. It links to actually when you first answered that question in terms of happiness, kind of thinking about the like social security, saying that there's the lowest number of homeless people as well, which would obviously be a very different picture if we like compared it to the UK as well. So thank you for elaborating on that for us. You did mention schools, and that's what we were going to go on to, because some of the graphs as a teacher I find really interesting, and I know that other teachers may be watching and will do as well. But you mentioned about how Finland doesn't really have many private schools, or if they do, it's not as high paying fees. So a few of the graphs which I do have that we can look at, one saying that Finland had the smallest between school variation, and the second which illustrated that social mobility is not linked to parents' income. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about these two graphs which you talked about in your book.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And one thing which I didn't know, which we discovered when writing the book, was that part of the reason that Finland has these schools as it has, because Finland used to have a very divided school system. It had grammar schools that only a few people could go to, and then in effect secondary moderns that the most people went to. Finnish educational researchers came to Britain to see how we did things in the 60s, and they copied us. So and implemented it. And the Finns were themselves surprised. It was when across the European Union that people started to compare pupils and get pupils to do tests in their ability to do maths, problem solving, literacy, and so on. That suddenly it came out that Finnish children were incredibly good on average. And at the age of 16, being able to speak at least rudimentarily about 6 different languages, and at 18, sometimes as many as 8, and that just being normal. And by this, for our audience here, actually speaking those languages, not our GCSE French and German kind of thing, but also being good at science as well. And it's what happens when you take when you ensure that schools are kind of equally resourced, and you don't have a situation where people are trying very hard to get their child into one school rather than another, because things begin to go badly wrong when you do that, and badly wrong for everybody. So in Finland, the schools are not monitored very much. The teachers are left alone to decide how they do things. And many teachers visit Finland to go and see how the schools work, particularly head teachers, and they're often shocked when they first go into a Finnish school. I mean, children don't wear shoes often because it's can be snowy outside, but but why do they need to wear shoes? The schools can look undisciplined. Children will be sitting all around the place doing what they want, and particularly now in our way of thinking, the idea of letting children talk in lessons to each other. We don't think of doing that, but it builds up over time. So teaching becomes a highly valued profession. The autonomy of teachers becomes seen as very, very important. They actually, should say this quietly for the teachers, they actually spend less on education in Finland than we do. But remember, they've sorted out housing and all other kind of things. So, you're not going, I have to be paid more as a teacher because I can't possibly get a house. So it's not actually the amount of money, it's the autonomy, but a pride in it, and the sense that every child matters. And if you're trying to work out why does Finland do so well, even compared to other Nordic countries, the Finns have a model of worrying most about the children who are doing worse at school, the bottom quarter, partly because in the past people just left Finland. You emigrated, they were always losing population. And if you don't worry about the bottom quarter, your country will depopulate in that case. Now Finland has people moving there, and there's more immigration. But it sounds trivially simple, the idea that you would worry most and concentrate most on the children who are falling behind, and just let the high flyers get on by their own, or they can actually help other children. And the other sense, and I don't know, sometimes it just sounds stupidly simple to me about this. They actually worry about education. They're not worrying about exam grades. So it's not a question of how many children can you tip over and get them a C at GCSE or whatever it is, grade 6 now or grade 5, and how many can you get an 8 or a 9. Because of course you can always have an education system that maximizes that at age 16 or at age 18. It's very different to actually want to educate and teach in general and to learn. And the Finns have produced a much more nerdy population as a result of this. Whereas in countries that are more divided, you end up worrying far more about examinations and, geography, 6-pointer questions, 9-point questions, how to write down the answer that will get you the 9 points rather than necessarily the correct answer. I mean, it's a terrible situation we're in. Because if you actually want to get the high grade at geography A Level or GCSE, you have to know what you're supposed to say rather than use your imagination and say something interesting. And essentially, Finland's kept up the idea of doing it differently, and we can get quite defensive about this. But Annika Koljonen, my co-author, is only in her early 20s, and can and to her English, this is terrible to say, I'm not great at writing, I always have a lot of help. Her English is better than mine, and that's not even her second language, and she's not that unusual for a Finnish person. So we've got to take our hands off to the thing. Say they have done very well. And it's not just Finland. The other Nordic countries do well. They do well in Germany and Denmark and so on, and pretty well in the Netherlands. You can look at a large part of Northern Europe and see that people are literate. Their maths ability doesn't disappear when they leave school. When you test them at 24, they can still do maths. They don't hate maths much. It's when we really should learn from it, because it's not a terrible system. And there's also a sense that people are in it together. So to give you one example, not from Finland, but primary schools in Norway. I had a colleague once who went to live in Norway for a bit and was completely shocked when one day a child turned up at the door with the entire class, because this primary school kid was going to look at all the children were visiting their homes to see where all the other children lived. And that makes it sound like an odd thing to do. But the idea is that you're all in it together, you're all friends, you go and see what each other does. And it's those kind of things that are quite alien to people in more unequal countries. And we think, oh, how could that possibly help? But having a sense of caring for each other actually has huge educational benefits.
Well, I think you might have maybe encouraged a few geography teachers or other teachers to go and check out the schools in Finland, because I think that sounds, and we had Ikra just write in the comments saying, yes, I hate that the UK educational system is so focused on grades rather than learning. But yeah, you're so right. It's really focused on those examinations as well for students. And actually what models, I would love to have so much less accountability and just to kind of teach what you thought was really important as well. Although I do obviously sway off different things and make sure my class get to certain topics. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that answer to that. So
can I say one other thing though that helps on this? Because the schools are so equal in Finland, there's a big variation of how children do in the school still, but because they're so equal, all the schools kind of get a similar proportion of pushy parents, let's put it that way. And okay, pushy parents can be a bit annoying as a teacher, but if you teach in a school where there are almost no pushy parents, then things can go wrong and nobody kind of notices. And if there's too many pushy parents, you spend all your time dealing with the pushy parents. And this is one reason why the equality and the mixing in Finland really helps the schools, because in every schools there are children whose parents will be professionals, will do well, and so on. But there isn't a school where all the children of people who are paid less are put together, and that makes it easier for the teacher. You don't have what you hear often in Britain of people saying, oh, it's so hard to teach in this school because it's like this or because it's like that. As a teacher, you can't really complain about the schools. The schools are the same. So, it's kind of like down to you and the children. And you just want to do well, and they enjoy it.
And one thing that's been in the news a lot within the UK's educational system, or England's educational system, is the amount of students who are shut out from the educational system through I can't even think of what the word is. My brain's gone to mush.
Or being excluded.
Being excluded, and how you're saying that how Finland actually spends the most amount of money on the bottom quarter of students in education as well. So I think it's kind of almost like flipped within the UK.
Yeah, although you don't have to. So two words you can't say in the Department of Education down in London on Marsham Street. The two countries you're not allowed to mention. One is Finland. They hate hearing about Finland in Marsham Street. But the other, interestingly, is Scotland. Because in the most recent year, the whole of Scotland, from all their secondary schools, only excluded 5 children, right? Just 5. Now, and we have the highest rate of exclusions in England, and it's interesting. I think, well, when I was at school, I'm very old, I'm 53. When I was at school, there were still caning children. We still had corporal punishment in our state and our private schools. We outlawed it in the state schools, and then a bit later in the private schools, you paid for the privilege. I suspect that being excluded from school in future will be seen as, in the same way now we look at corporal punishment. But at the moment we say, oh, it's absolutely necessarily, we couldn't run a school with that. And it's not just Finland. So, for instance, in France, if a child is very dangerous in a school in France, particularly it's normally about violence, the agent of the state comes and picks the child up and takes them to the next school they're going to be going to that same day, so that they're not out of the system. And it's a particular problem now with the pandemic, because of course so many children are out of school, that we still have quite a high number of children not in our schools at the moment, and a school system that doesn't think it's that abnormal to exclude children. And that's the example of the kind of thing that goes wrong, and has terrible repercussions for children.
What though, Finland can't be perfect. So what issues though do exist in Finland?
There's quite a few. When it comes to inequality, the worst issue I think that exists is university access. So when you look at who actually gets into university in Finland, although the universities, they don't have the hierarchy we have, right? All the universities are seen as good. There isn't a silliness. I can say this coming from my university. I think it's silly, our hierarchical system. But the upper middle class and middle class dominate the university still. Now, manual work is very well paid in Finland and secure. So, but there's a lack of mobility there. Then there are other issues. Now, most of them are getting better. So there was a problem with gambling in Finland, that's reducing. There was a problem with alcohol, that's reducing. There's a problem with suicide, that's reducing. There's racism in Finland. They have a party called the Free Finns Party, which is essentially anti-immigration and worried about change and racist. So Finland's not a utopia, and that party can get a lot of votes from the old. So I don't want to overplay how well things work in Finland. It just happens to be that at the moment, the four political parties in charge, and then like the rest of Europe, Finland has a modern democracy. You have PR, you don't have our system. The four political parties in charge are all progressive. Actually, it's five. Sorry, and the five leaders are all women. And the youngest prime minister in Europe is actually in charge. But behind that kind of facade, that there are these worries and older people worried about the change. And if I was Finnish, given how well people do in Finland and given free movement in Europe, it's only the cold that stops. Why isn't there mass migration of people from the rest of Europe to Finland? And so far there isn't that much, but that's the kind of thing that can worry people. The house prices in Helsinki are fairly high. Issues like that. Trying to make a decision about whether you make the third Swedish as official language as well as Finnish, but whether to make English an official language or not. And would that actually be detrimental, or would it be an advantage? But can you imagine us? Well, can you imagine us in Britain worrying about, what's our third official language going to be? Most people aren't even aware that we use Welsh as an official language, because we hardly do it at all. Let alone talk about what's the third one going to be.
And you kind of talked about kind of the issues Finland has, but what was the thing that surprised you most when writing the book or researching Finland?
Oh, the problem is you get used to things, so that when it originally surprises you, it doesn't later. I think discovering that so many people had summer houses. Now, of course, Finland is very, very large. There's lots of space, but many, many people or their families have a rickety house, often next to a lake somewhere further up north, that you can decamp to in the summer. Oh, and it's really warm in the summer. That's 20 degrees. So, that looks sort of slightly like a life of luxury, that you're able to do that. It's not just Finland that has that. New Zealand has a history of doing this as well. But I wasn't aware of that at all until I looked. And also people having the idea that they have a proper rest in the summer and switch off and go back to nature. those kind of things, which is interesting to see because you can endlessly talk about the kind of society you'd like to have and how wouldn't it be lovely if we were like this or that. But I'm much more interested in seeing, is there somebody somewhere actually doing something now that shows it's possible to be like that? I think it's more convincing. And then you've got to ask yourself, why haven't you got it? And the tricky questions about, well, who's trying to stop you having this kind of a life? Because the Finns worked hard to get it and to keep it, and they have to keep on working hard to keep it. But it's that side, I suppose I can. Talking to geography professors in Finland was quite interesting. When they would actually talk about how great it was to be a professor of geography in Finland, despite the fact that pay is much less than in England, but everything else was so much better, and they didn't have to worry about the crime in a particular area or where they lived or the health. That actually being paid less was fine, and this is a problem for an unequal country, in that for Finland, when the income inequality is much lower, that means that teachers are paid less than teachers here, but university professors are paid less than here. Everybody who's paid more than average in Britain is paid less in Finland. That's how you get a greater equality, and that's how people who are paid much less in England can be paid more in Finland. So it was seeing the support for equality amongst people who materially would have been better off in a more unequal society. I should say, the other, just the difference in attitudes. I talked to a Conservative mayor from one of the right-wing parties, a mayor of a town who's very into the military side in Finland. There's a lot of guns in Finland, and there's a lot of conscription to the army and so on. But the Conservative mayor in Finland sounded like somebody from the left of the Labour Party in Britain in terms of their other attitudes. So your entire politics moves in one direction or the other. And if you live in a country, you tend to think that things are kind of spanned around you, but they're normal, and there's this on the left and this on the right. But seeing a whole country where all the attitudes had moved in one direction, were more green, that is a bit of a shock when you first see it. I think it would help if we're more happy. I
Sorry, Danny, I just actually muted myself. So I'm going to have to repeat that so everyone can see. So I was just saying, thank you, Ikra, for saying that on the chat. Just saying that I was linking to Anna's question as well and my question. And so Danny, in his book, The Equality Effect, argued that greater equality benefits everyone, rich, poor, and everyone in between. So can the UK or other countries replicate the Finnish model? And from Anna's question, does the UK, how can we learn from Finland? Do we need to increase our happiness levels?
That's a great question. I think we do need to increase our happiness levels. The Prince Charles Trust, does a survey every year of young people in Britain and their levels of happiness and hopes for the future, and it's pretty dismal reading. For at least 6 or 7 years, it's got worse each year. And it's not great. And if you're a young person in Britain, you're thinking, how am I going to get a home? How can I start a family? It is a bit of a mess. However, if you take Europe of almost 30 countries in Europe, Finland is at the top, if you like, of the class of 30 in terms of equality. And I'm afraid, along with Bulgaria, we're at the bottom. And you can't really jump from being at the bottom of the league table to the top. We probably need to look at countries like Germany, which are more in the middle. For what's more achievable, and what could be done. But where we shouldn't be looking is where we often look, which is the United States. And we often look to the US and say, how can we do things like they do? Charter schools, discipline, marching corridors, all that kind of stuff that's coming from the States. The States has a terrible social record, a terrible health record, a terrible homelessness record. We really shouldn't be looking at USA as a model of how we do things. We should be looking elsewhere in Europe. We can pick and choose. The Netherlands is very good on housing policy. Vienna's brilliant on that. You can kind of look around Europe to see where things work and then try to move towards it. And one of the sort of sad things in recent years is we've done the opposite of that. We've kind of cut ourselves off from the continent. And, we're going to do it our own way. And we're not even aware of these differences between European countries. The average family in Spain, Italy, France and Germany, the median family is better off than the median family in the UK, and pays less for their housing, and has a higher quality of housing, and has a more equal education system, and can go to university if they want to without paying it. And, I don't want to put us down, but we should at least know this, that something has gone wrong. And we wrote this book about Finland to try to be optimistic and to say, amazing things are possible, but it took the Finns a long time. It took 2 or 3 generations to really embed this in. And now it's so embedded, it's quite hard to knock it. And just give you one last example on that. They brought in free school meals in the Second World War. They're not called free school meals, everybody gets them, they're just called school lunch. And holiday food, they've had it in Helsinki again since the Second World War. So the kind of debates we have about which children should get a meal for it, just like you get a desk and a chair at school, you also get fed. But it's not just Finland. Japan does this as well. Other places do. And this is a lovely thing about international geography and comparisons. You can look and see and say this happens here, and then try and work out why doesn't it happen in other places, and is it a good or a bad thing? And most importantly, does it create problems? Does it create a lazy nation? Are the Finns not inventing things and so on? And then what you find is actually their businesses are brilliant. Their levels of invention and patents are higher. So theoretically, there may be a point where you look after people too much and they stop doing anything. But Finland is the opposite. They're much more energetic than we are.
Thank you. And I'm going to group some of these questions together. I'm not sure how much you, in terms of the changing places unit in geography, students have to learn about endogenous and exogenous factors, and there has been a question about that. But first of all, before that, Harry has said, how has colonialism impacted Finland? If you could,
that is such a good question, and in a way, I think we can use this to make ourselves feel happier about Britain. Because we're opposite. So Britain, I wish we did teach this in geography more, but 100 years ago, this country was at the centre of the largest empire the world has ever known. And that really matters. If you're trying to work out why is life in Britain as it is today, we lost our empire. When I was a school child, the last few remaining colonies got their freedom. We didn't want them to. We were very reluctant about it. That's not how we talk about it, but we didn't want them all to go, and they did. And we made a lot of money out of our empire, and it allowed us to do things, well, even at one extreme, it allowed us to afford a national health service when we brought that in. Finland is the opposite. Finland has been a colony of Sweden, a colony of Germany, a colony of Russia. It's never controlled another country outside. And so the Finns have never had a kind of sense of superiority or the idea that they should be great or the greatest, whereas we have, and it's understandable if you were the centre of the largest empire the world has ever known, that you might have this. And you can see it in the way that Americans sometimes talk now, USA, America's great, all that kind of thing. Well, we were a bit like that. And so this may partly explain why does Finland do particularly well, because there's a sense that Finns have to look after each other. Nobody else was going to do. In fact, they were going to exploit Finnish people, and Finland was losing people. So it matters, I think, quite a lot. And it also helps explain this empire situation, because our empire was bigger than the empires of all the other European countries put together. If you're wondering why are we the most unequal country in Europe, why do we have this legacy of educational systems? My department, Oxford Geography Department, we were created for a letter to the Times newspaper in something like 1899 to set up a Department of Geography to train colonial officers to help run the empire. That's why the Geography Department began in Oxford. This is the country we are from, and it has a legacy, a continuation of the idea that some people will lead and other people need to be led, and we should be number one. And the irony is that the place which never had that, Finland, ends up ranking first, second, and third in over 100 social indicators by not trying to be number one, just trying to be decent to each other.
And so in terms of going to those kind of looking at the factors that influence Finland and the endogenous and exogenous factors. So, for example, like the UK has also had loads of migration, which has influenced our place. Do you think that Finland's success is more factors like internally that has contributed to Finland's success rather than external kind of like flows of investment or flows of people? What would you...
Yeah. I'm suspicious of the endogenous and whatever, but the problem is, of course, because it's Britain, you have to give the answers that the people trained to mark will give. So you could take a country like Canada, which has had incredible immigration and done pretty well with it. You can do well. Or the other thing, one thing me and Annika do is we look around all the other countries in the world which were sort of similarly cold, because people sometimes try and be deterministic and they say, oh, the Finns have done well because the winters are hard and they had to be really tough to do that. Well, you can find parts of Siberia which are like that. So the geographical determinist arguments don't tend to work. Chance works, luck. Something could have gone wrong at a particular point in Finland. There could have been a set of politicians in the 70s who weren't particularly nice, but who somehow managed to gain control of Finland, but they didn't. Being where Finland was in the Cold War, being a neighbour of Russia, may have actually helped. And there's all kinds of things that you can look at.
It's a way too big a question for you to even.
And of course you can never really know because we don't have that many countries in the world. But it's important to remember, and it wasn't just Britain that the Finns came to have a look at. They also went to the USA in the 60s and to look at things like the civil rights movement in the USA and what was going on there, because Finland in the 60s was behind other countries, was not progressive, and they did a very clever going and picking and choosing, and then keeping the things that they thought were worth keeping, and learning from other places. So that's part of what Finland did. But as I say, somewhere will always be most equal. There will always be. So it isn't necessarily about that particular place. It's often chance, luck, and circumstance.
And that kind of answers Anna's questions. So Anna's kind of answer that you talked about, and in your first actually chapter of the book, you talk about the actual physical geography of Finland and how that isn't that kind of the factor that influences happiness and equality. It's many of the other factors that have all pulled together. So you kind of break down that idea, or like disconnect the kind of physical geography from happiness and equality.
Yeah, physical geography is obviously important in some ways, and some Europe 600 years ago was at the kind of bottom of the world scale for living standards. Right, it's only because we were on the west side of Asia, and the ocean currents worked in such a way, and a new world was there, that Europe became rich. And it was the silver that we got from the Americas that really mattered, because silver was the only thing that China wanted. Anything it needed. We didn't make we didn't make silver, but we had nothing to trade until the Americans. And first of all, Spain and Portugal, but then Britain had an advantage, and we funded pirates, and we took over from Spain and Portugal, and that's how we became rich. So the physical geography matters in things, but it's often these very sort of long-term physical geography aspects that have an effect. And there's a danger of thinking that there's something special about your place simply because it had an advantage in 1492, you know, over that, and you know, I think it's sort of worth stepping back and looking at, you know, Finland was the poorest place in Europe 200 years ago. You really didn't want to be there. Nothing was going right. You wanted to leave. So it can give you kind of quite good hope for what is possible in the future. You know, things really can change.
And just to add on, for students who are watching, if you are doing your NEA or deciding topics to it, inequality can be a really interesting thing to discuss. And I know some students even kind of looked at your book, the along the line, kind of seeing how inequality changes along the tube stops, but particularly honing in on smaller areas. So is there anything that you would, if students wanted to research inequality in their local area, what would you say to them? Would you say keep it small to different localities? From your area of expertise, how would you advise students to go about investigating inequality?
I would advise them to try and be novel. So school teachers often get annoyed with the same old comparison of the rich part and poor part of a particular town, which that students live in, which often then leads to the kind of increasing stereotypes anyway. So try not to repeat what is always done, but look for a more interesting way of doing it and doing things, which is really annoying, I suppose, advice, because you're saying to somebody, you know, come up with something which hasn't been done before, but it can be more interesting to do that. And well, you know, I'm somebody who has to mark lots of undergraduate student dissertations, and it's almost always the ones where somebody has thought of doing something in a different way that are more interesting to read than the others. So I wouldn't always do the comparison of the poorest part of town and the richest part of town. But the kind of things which are interesting is you can look at one street. There's a series of streets in different cities of Britain that have been looked at, and how things have changed. Or I'll give you one last one, which I don't think has been much done by school children, but can be. You can look at, if you happen to have a Victorian cemetery in your town, particularly one that's not used anymore. It's much better if it's not used. You can look at the inequality in the Victorian times by looking at the height of gravestones and the ages of the people who died on the gravestone, and then where they were from. And in a way, your Victorian cemetery is actually a map of the social inequalities of Victorian times. And if you want to get really into it, it's a bit morbid, but you can look at the age gap between men and women. They're often buried together. Average difference of about 5 years, but it gets wider in economic depressions, and it gets narrower in good times. So, you know, that's something which sounds a bit odd and a bit strange to do, but is different. And of course, it's not that hard to collect the data because the data is on the stones but something which is try and be a little bit different. And it'll also, I think, make your teachers' lives more interesting, because they won't go, oh, not another survey of this or that, which they see so often.
And also, I think that's fantastic leaving it open as well, because you can't say do a novel idea such as this, otherwise everybody will just kind of take the one idea you just sent out. So,
but the only people watching this have heard about the gravestone one, so you
keep them coming through. And the final thing, I know you just given some fantastic advice in the NEA, but a lot of our students are going through up into university or other career choices after school. Do you have any other advice from your own career experience that you can kind of end the interview, or from working with students at university that you just have advice to give to students for the end of this interview?
Oh, for things to do. If you can possibly live abroad, go abroad and spend 3 months or more abroad, do it. You'll learn more from living abroad than almost anything else in almost any other country. And you won't learn from your first couple of weeks somewhere else. You've got to be there for a length of time. It is, I could say this quietly it is still possible to go to abroad to university. British universities don't like to tell you that because we want to get all the students. But for example, Germany has more overseas students than the UK does. I think over 300,000 overseas students, and they don't charge you fees. But you've probably got to learn German. But essentially, that's somebody paying you 60, 70, 80,000 pounds, which is what going to university will cost you with the interest and the debt, just to learn German. So, or think about going to Dublin or so on. So, for geographers, just a little bit brave, have a little look and just think, could I do that? Because I grew up in Oxford. I went to Newcastle University, which was a long way away, and I went in an era before mobile phones. So I had to go to a phone box to phone home. The equivalent in the future, when the world has settled down, is to go and spend some time in another country. And the other thing I'd say is you don't necessarily have to go to university immediately. If you can work or do something else for a year, and also what your A Level grades are then. So you're not in this great worry about will I get the grades that I need for the place I want. For the women watching this, on average, you probably live to 100. The men 95. What is this helter-skelter need to immediately go to university at 18? Why not be slightly calmer about it? But universities don't tend to tell you this message because we're all competing to get students. So kind of keep it to yourself and don't tell any other university I said this, but just take a little bit more time over it, and everything doesn't end if you don't get into the place you wanted to immediately after school.
Brilliant advice. Thank you for that honest advice. And for students to go and explore different options. I completely agree about students being pushed through kind of the system. Sometimes we need a pause to think about what we're doing and how we can learn as well. Well, thank you so much. Your book is available in bookshops now. Yes, where students can go get. It's been really fantastic to talk. And thank you everybody for watching and contributing to the really good questions as well. So from everybody at the Curious Geographer, Danny, thank you very much for being a guest on the interview. And I'm just going to end by saying to everybody else really quickly, this is the end of our series for this term. If you haven't already, do check out the other live interviews. They are all fantastic. It's probably been my favourite term in terms of guests as well. So please do check out that by following the QR code, and they're all up on YouTube as well. But from me, have a lovely evening, everybody. And that's it from me.